The Giant's Challenge. The gym smelled of sweat and worn leather, the air thick with the sound of punches echoing off the concrete walls. Bruce Lee moved like a shadow between the punching bags, his feet barely touching the ground as he executed a series of side kicks, each impact precise, each movement an extension of his own breathing. Around him, fighters of varying weights trained, but few dared to interrupt the master. It was then that he arrived. A man with shoulders as broad as steel beams, arms as thick as tree trunks, entered the room with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. It was George, a 270-pound wrestling champion known for crushing opponents with his brute strength. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Bruce, who barely weighed more than 135 kilos, and a sneer curved his lips. "You're that kung fu guy, aren't you?" George crossed his arms, his muscles swelling under his shirt. "I heard you're fast. But speed means nothing without strength. You're too light to be dangerous." Bruce stopped, fingers still slightly flexed after a mid-air swipe. There was no anger on his face, just a calm that seemed to defy the very weight of the giant in front of him. "Strength and speed are not opposites, George. They complement each other." His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a certainty that made some of those present stop to listen. The champion laughed, a deep sound that reverberated through the gym. "Then show me. Let's see if your theory works in practice." Bruce nodded without hesitation. The two positioned themselves in the center of the mat, surrounded by curious eyes. George flexed his fingers, preparing to grab his smaller opponent and prove his point. Bruce, in turn, remained relaxed, knees slightly bent, eyes fixed on his opponent's chest, not his eyes, not his hands, but the man's center of gravity. The giant charged forward with a roar, hands reaching out to grab Bruce by the neck. It was a simple, direct movement, calculated to dominate with sheer force. But the moment his fingers closed in the void, Bruce was no longer there. He sidestepped, so quickly that the air seemed to move with him. Before George could react, Bruce spun on his axis, and his right foot shot out like a whip. The side kick connected with the champion's flank with the precision of a blade, the sound of the impact echoing like dry thunder. George staggered, eyes wide with surprise, but he didn't fall. "Not yet." "That was luck," he grunted, recovering. Bruce didn't respond. He knew words wouldn't convince a man like George. Just actions. The giant tried again, this time more cautiously, but still confident in his physical superiority. He lunged forward, arms spread like claws. Bruce waited until the last second, then ducked in one fluid motion, sliding under the attack. As George passed him, Bruce spun and delivered a short, explosive punch to his opponent's exposed rib. The blow was so quick that George didn't even see it coming. His entire body contracted, the air escaping his lungs in a hoarse moan. He tried to turn around, but Bruce was already behind him, applying an armbar with the precision of a surgeon. George resisted, muscles trembling under the pressure, but Bruce's technique was relentless. With a sudden movement, he twisted the giant's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. "Surrender," said Bruce, his voice still calm, but now filled with undeniable authority. George gritted his teeth, his face red with exertion and humiliation. He tried to get up, but Bruce increased the pressure, and a sharp crack echoed through the gym. The champion let out a muffled scream and hit his free hand on the mat 3 times. Bruce released him immediately, stepping back as calmly as he had started. George stood slowly, holding his aching arm, his eyes now filled with something that was no longer disdain, it was respect. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Bruce smiled, adjusting his gloves. "Force without control is just violence. Speed without purpose is waste. When the two meet, there is no weight that can resist." George nodded, speechless. He knew he had just learned a lesson that no amount of strength training could ever teach. And so, the little dragon proved that sometimes true power isn't in size, but in the way it moves. The weight of wisdom. The gym, once filled with the roar of the audience, now fell silent in a reverent murmur. The younger students exchanged incredulous looks, while the seniors, accustomed to seeing George crush opponents with brutal blows, lowered their fists in perplexity. Bruce remained motionless, his bare feet firmly on the mat, as if the floor itself recognized his authority. But his eyes, dark and serene, did not seek applause. He knew that the real battle had not yet begun. On the other side of the hall, among the shadows of the stands, a figure watched everything with a cold smile. It was Victor, George's trainer, a man with broad shoulders and scars that snaked down his neck like the roots of an ancient tree. He didn't applaud. It didn't move. He just crossed his arms, his fingers drumming on his biceps with a calculated rhythm. Interesting, he thought. But not enough. You've got technique, boy, Victor said finally, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. But technique without hunger is like a dull sword. Beautiful, but useless. He took a step forward, heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. George has been my student for 5 years. You humiliated him in 5 minutes. That's not victory. That's luck. Bruce didn't move. I knew this was no ordinary challenge. Victor was not a fighter, he was a strategist, a man who shaped warriors like a sculptor carves marble. And he wasn't there to test his moves. If you want to prove that your philosophy is worth more than muscles, then fight with me, Victor continued, slowly taking off his coat, revealing his shoulders marked by tattoos of intertwined dragons. But it won't be on the mat. It will be on the street. Tonight. No rules. No judges. Just you, me, and the asphalt. A murmur ran through the crowd. Fighting in the streets was prohibited by the academy, a line that no respectable student crossed. But Victor was not a student. It was the unwritten law of that world. George, still holding his injured arm, looked at Bruce with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. He doesn't play, man. Victor has already broken the ribs of guys who didn't even challenge him. If he accepts it, it won't be like here. Bruce took a deep breath. It wasn't fear I felt, but the weight of the choice. If he refused, he would be seen as a coward. If he accepted, he would be entering a game whose rules he didn't know. But there was something about the way Victor viewed him, not as an adversary, but as a puzzle to be solved. Okay, Bruce said simply. But on one condition, if I win, George trains with me. Without your interference. Victor let out a short laugh, almost a growl. You're bold. I like that. But it's not going to happen. George is mine. And you, he pointed a thick finger in Bruce's direction, will learn why no one challenges Viktor Petrov without consequences. The night does not forgive. The alley behind the gym smelled of burning oil and urine. Broken light bulbs cast jagged shadows on the brick walls, and the only sound was the distant hum of a car passing on the avenue. Bruce arrived first, his hands bare, his feet bare, a deliberate choice. Victor appeared minutes later, accompanied by 2 men in leather jackets, their faces impassive. No witnesses, said Victor, throwing a rusty chain on the ground. Just us. Bruce didn't respond. He watched Victor's men position themselves at the exits of the alley, blocking any escape. I knew it wouldn't be a fair fight. But justice was not what Victor offered. The first blow came without warning. One of the henchmen came forward with a large punch, which Bruce deflected with a minimal movement of his body, using the man's momentum against himself. The henchman stumbled, but before he could recover, Victor was in motion, the chain spinning in his hand like a metal snake. Bruce ducked at the last second, feeling the wind from the current pass by his ear. He rolled to the side, avoiding a low kick, and counterattacked with a quick sequence of blows to the kidneys of the second henchman, who fell to his knees, coughing. But Victor wasn't like the others. He didn't back down. He advanced again, the chain now wrapped around his wrist like a whip. This time, Bruce didn't dodge. The moment the chain snapped in the air, he stepped forward, within the arc of the blow, and grabbed Victor's wrist with both hands. The movement was so fast that the coach had no time to react. Bruce twisted his arm downward, using Victor's own weight against him, and forced him to his knees. The alley was silent. Uncontrolled force is violence, Bruce repeated, his voice calm, almost a whisper. Speed without purpose is waste. You taught George to be strong, but not to think. And a warrior who doesn't think is just an animal with fangs. Victor tried to get up, but Bruce pressed his knee against his back, immobilizing him. You lose because you rely too much on what you already know. And I win because I'm willing to learn. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. Then, with a grunt, he slammed his hand down 3 times. Bruce released him. The henchman, now standing, looked to Victor for orders. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust off his pants, his eyes fixed on Bruce. You won today. But it doesn't end here. He turned to George, who was watching everything from afar, still holding his arm. Train with him. See what he has to teach you. But remember, the world out there is not a mat. And one day, you will have to choose which side you are on. With that, Victor and his men disappeared into the darkness, leaving Bruce and George alone in the alley. Dragon's Legacy. The following weeks were transformative. George, once an arrogant fighter who relied only on strength, now trained with a discipline that surprised even Bruce. He learned to anticipate movements, to use his opponent's weight against him, to fight not with anger, but with precision. And, for the first time, he began to understand that true mastery was not in winning, but in how you won. Bruce, in turn, did not become a teacher. He just showed the way. Because he knew that each fighter had to find his own answer. A month later, the gym was closed. Not because of a lack of students, on the contrary, it had never been so full. But because Victor, in an act of wounded pride, challenged Bruce to an official fight, in the ring, with high stakes and the presence of scouts from international tournaments. It was a trap. Everyone knew. But Bruce accepted. The fight was short. Victor entered with the same arrogance as always, trusting in his strength and experience. But Bruce didn't fight him. He fought with him. Victor's every blow was deflected, every attack was redirected, until, in a moment of pure frustration, the trainer tried a desperate attack. Bruce grabbed him, spun him in the air, and placed him gently on the ground, as if he were putting a child to sleep. You still don't understand, do you? Bruce said, helping him to get up. It's not about winning. It's about growing. Victor didn't respond. He just looked at George, who was watching everything standing at the side of the ring. Then, without a word, he left the gym. He was never seen again. The last teaching. Years later, Bruce was no longer the little dragon. He was a respected master, with his own academy and students who came from far and wide to learn his methods. George, now a professional wrestler, had become his right-hand man, teaching newcomers that true strength lies not in size, but in the way you move. One night, as they were closing the gym, George found a letter on Bruce's desk. There was no sender, but the handwriting was unmistakable. You won in the ring. But life is not a ring. One day, someone will test you where there are no rules. And then, we will see if your philosophy is still worth something. V. George crumpled the paper, but Bruce took it back, smoothing it out carefully. He's right, you know, said Bruce, putting the letter in his pocket. The world out there is unforgiving. But it's not fear that defines us. It's what we do with it. George nodded. I knew the fight would never end. It just changed shape. And so, the dragon continued flying, not because there were no storms, but because it had learned to dance with them. The weight of shadows. The following days were marked by silent tension. Bruce trained harder, his punches on the punching bag echoing through the gym like thunder. George, in turn, observed the streets with a more attentive eye, as if he expected the sender of the letter to materialize among the shadows of the streetlights. A week later, the inevitable happened. It was a Friday, and the gym was almost empty when 3 men entered. They were not fighters. His clothes were too expensive, his movements too calculated. The leader, a man with an angular face and a scar on his eyebrow, stood in front of Bruce with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Vince sends his regards," he said, throwing an envelope on the table. "He wants a demonstration. Tomorrow, at the old port warehouse. Just you. No cameras, no police. If you don't show up, he'll start breaking things you like." Bruce didn't touch the envelope. He just crossed his arms. "What if I say I'm not interested?" The man laughed, a dry sound like burning paper. "Then you'll find that Vince doesn't make threats. He makes promises." They left as silently as they entered, leaving behind the smell of expensive leather and menace. George waited until the door closed before speaking. "You're not going alone." Bruce looked at him, eyes dark like polished steel. "It's not your fight." "Yes it is," George replied, firmly. "Because you taught me that strength isn't in winning alone. It's in knowing when you need someone by your side." Bruce hesitated. But deep down, I knew George was right. Vince wasn't just any opponent. He was a man who operated on the margins, where the rules of the ring were worthless. The warehouse. The place was a skeleton of concrete and rust, lit only by light bulbs hanging from exposed wires. Vince was there, surrounded by half a dozen men, all with the same cold gaze. Beside him, an improvised ring, the ropes worn and stained with something that could be sweat or blood. Bruce entered first, George close behind. Vince smiled, pleased. "I'm glad you came. And you brought a friend. This will be fun." George didn't wait. As soon as one of the henchmen approached, he advanced, dodging the first punch and responding with a precise kick to the man's ribs, who fell with a groan. Bruce, in turn, didn't waste time with foreplay. Vince was their target. The first blow was blocked, but the second hit the opponent's chin, making him retreat. Vince laughed, wiping the blood from his lip. "You like playing heroes, don't you? But heroes die young." What followed was a brutal dance. Vince didn't fight like a boxer, he fought like a predator, using anything within his reach, chairs, chains, even a rusty pipe. George found himself surrounded by 2 men, but he used the agility Bruce had taught him, spinning around and kicking one of them into a pile of crates. Bruce, however, was at a disadvantage. Vince was faster than he looked, and his punches carried the strength of someone who wasn't afraid to break bones. When Bruce finally took him down with an uppercut, Vince spat out blood and smiled. "Is that all you have?" It was then that George saw the knife. Vince pulled it from his jacket pocket, the blade glinting in the dim light. Bruce backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The warehouse was a trap. George acted on instinct. He picked up an iron bar lying on the ground and threw it with all his strength. The slash hit Vince's arm, sending the knife flying away. The man screamed, more in anger than in pain. "You son of a..." Bruce didn't let him finish. A punch to the stomach, another to the face, and Vince fell to his knees, panting. "Life is not a ring," Bruce said, echoing the words of the letter. "But that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want." Vince spat again, but there was no longer any challenge in his eyes. Just hate. "This isn't over." "It's over for today," George intervened, pulling Bruce by the arm. "Let's go." They left without looking back, leaving Vince and his men in the dark. The next day. The gym was silent. Bruce sat on the bench, his knuckles swollen, his face marked with bruises. George handed him an ice pack. "Will he come back?" Bruce sighed. "Probably. But not today. Vince is a coward. He likes to attack when he thinks he has the upper hand." George nodded. "So we get ready." Bruce looked at him, a tired smile on his lips. "You learned quickly." "I had a good teacher." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of traffic outside. The dragon was still flying. The storms would still come. But now, he didn't fly alone.